Professor Will Mandy is another one of our 1 month fellows in November. He is a professor of neurodevelopmental conditions in the Division of Psychology at UCL London. Yes, and thank you so much for joining us, and please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much. Yes. So today, both I guess in my role as a clinical psychologist, but also an autism researcher, I'm addressing this question of what is autism now, which is a question that's become increasingly difficult to answer and has become increasingly contested in the last few years. And in doing so, I'm looking to engage with how the autism construct has changed since its inception, and to share some of my thinking about what's been driving that change. So to start at the beginning, autism first arises in the clinical literature in the 1930s and 1940s, simultaneously described by two German-speaking physicians, Hans Asperger, working in Vienna, and Leo Kanner, working in Baltimore in the USA. So, for example, Kanner noticed children coming through his clinic at Johns Hopkins whose presentation didn't fit with any of the existing diagnoses he had available to him at the time. And these were children like Donald, who was in fact the first person to be diagnosed autistic. So Donald was happiest when left alone. He made stereotyped, repetitive movements. He spun with great pleasure. He used language, but in a way that seemed unusual to the non-autistic people around him, as being viewed as literal and inflexible. And perhaps most strikingly to the people around him, he was thought to completely disregard the people in a room and instead to prefer to engage with objects. And on the basis of these sorts of observations, and of other children like Donald, Kanner wrote this very influential paper that starts with this sentence that marks the entry of autism really into mainstream clinical practice. And in line with the medical model in which he worked, Kanner came to the view that he was observing an as yet uncharacterized entity called autism. And he proposed that autism manifested with two types of core symptom, two types of observable behaviors. One concerned the social domain. We name that inborn autistic disturbances of affective contact, an unusual way of relating and understanding other people. And then he also named a second symptom cluster, as it would be called in medical language, a non-social set of symptoms reflecting a powerful desire for sameness, a resistance to change, and an enjoyment of routine and ritual. And in one sense, Kanner's original description of autism in the 1940s looks a lot like contemporary accounts of autism that you'll find in the diagnostic manuals, DSM-5, ICD-11, that guide practice today. So autism continues to be defined at the behavioral level, as we have no biomarkers for autism. We cannot observe it directly, but instead observe its hypothesized manifestations, which are known as symptoms in this context. And again, as Kanner postulated, autism is seen as having two real clusters of symptoms, one to do with the social domain, one to do with inflexibility, reflexive behavior, and also sensory processing, actually. And it's worth noting, in line with standard diagnostic practice and in psychiatric diagnosis, to be diagnosed as autistic, in addition to showing these core diagnostic symptoms, a person must also evidence having resultant impairment and disability. So that's an example of continuity, but there have been some fundamental changes in how autism is understood, and I'm going to describe some of these now. So the first one is that autism was initially considered a categorical condition, something qualitatively distinct from typical development and from other disorders or other conditions. So a good example of a genuinely categorical condition would be Down syndrome. You either have Down syndrome or you don't have Down syndrome. We're not all on a spectrum of Down syndrome. But there is fairly extensive empirical evidence that autism doesn't fit that model. and instead it's better thought of as a dimensional condition, representing one end of a trait distribution that extends right through the general population. And this is important for what I'm going to say later, with no natural cut point, no natural boundary between autism and non-autism, which of course leads us to the conclusion that the threshold that separates those diagnosed as autistic from those who have high traits but aren't considered autistic, it exists as a convention. It's not sort of observable and sort of sitting there to be seen in nature. Another important discovery since Canna's initial account is that one's position on this continuum, and also the question of whether or not you are autistic, whether you're above threshold, is mainly determined by genetic variability, with much more modest effects from environmental influences. So another change, I suppose you might say, in the culture and in clinical practice, and the way in which autism is thought about and talked about, has been what's going on at the moment, which is, I think, a transition from what people often call a classically medical or a pathology model to a model put forward by the neurodiversity movement. So we have another form of diversity, which is an interesting kind of echo of the first talk. And this is really about how the high levels of disability, alienation, and distress that are experienced by many autistic people, that are commonly experienced by autistic people, are understood. Under the medical model, which is a paradigm that has been dominant in practice for many, many years, and to be fair, is still pretty dominant in a lot of settings and in research. The idea is that there's quite a simple linear relationship between, on the one hand, the individual's autism-related characteristics, what would be seen in the medical model simply as impairments, and the disability they experience. So disability is really seen to arise very directly as an effect of brain-based autistic characteristics. The neurodiversity model, which really is, I think, in this sense, could be described as old wine in new bottles, in the sense that this is an idea that we would see in the social model of disability or developmental psychopathology paradigm that's been around for a while. This is a movement that's developed by autistic people, and it offers a more contextualized way of understanding the high levels of disability experienced by autistic people and people with high autistic traits. And so here, disability is so commonly experienced by autistic people is understood not as a direct consequence of differences in their brain functioning, but rather from a misfit, a mismatch between, on the one hand, the person, their capacities, their needs, and on the other hand, their environment, broadly defined, what it could be school, work, what it affords them, what it asks of them. Okay, and so this is the last change I'm going to talk about before moving on. It's a pretty substantial shift that's occurred since Canna first described autism, which is that autism was once considered to be a rare condition, and it's now considered in many, many countries to be common. Initially, when people did the first epidemiological prevalence studies in the 60s and 70s, they came back with the answer that autism is a rare and severe condition to be seen in maybe 1 in 2,500 children. And this remained broadly the consensus right up until the 1990s. And then, as you can see from this graph, something starts to change. And so begins a striking growth, both in the estimated prevalence of autism, but also the actual the so-called administrative prevalence, the actual rates of autism diagnosis. And this change, this growth, is actually continuing to this day in many countries. So in the UK, around 1 in 30 children have an autism diagnosis now, which represents an 80-fold increase from original estimates. It must be recognized that this phenomenon that's depicted on this graph is certainly most pronounced in high-income countries, and it's not seen in the same way, to the same extent, in all high-income countries. But it's certainly characteristic of the UK, where I work, and in the USA, and in many other countries. But a lot of what I'm acknowledging, that a lot of what I'm going to say today is focused on evidence from the UK and USA, and there's still an open question as to how generalizable it is to other contexts. Okay, so what's happening? What's going on here? Well, perhaps the simplest sort of idea that people reach for here is that there's an autism epidemic going on, that there are just more autistic people around. And this is an idea that we see reflected and embraced at the very highest levels, for example, of American government with implications for policy. It is possible that the thing itself, that autism has become somewhat more common since the 1940s. We can't rule that out, and there are a couple of plausible ideas that could drive modest increases, although we don't have direct evidence at all for an autism, a true increase in autism cases. And it's very unlikely that the huge increase in diagnosis that's been observed can be explained by the presence of an autism epidemic, in what is largely this condition. A much more compelling idea is that whilst there is an autism epidemic, there may be an epidemic of discovery, that advances in autism awareness, improvements in diagnostic measures, the great growth in services, that these have resulted in us identifying many autistic people who would have gone undiscovered had they lived earlier. And it seems very likely this is part of the picture, given that the developments there have been in autism assessment and the number of people who are now being diagnosed in adulthood who were missed in childhood. But as I'm going to argue, I really don't think that is the whole story. And that takes me to our next fairly obvious, I think, candidate to help us understand this rise, which is whether the threshold for diagnosis has been lowered, thereby making the diagnosis more inclusive. And I think it's interesting to take an analogy from physical health. On the 13th of November, 2017, the American Heart Association changed the threshold for high blood pressure. They lowered it. And as a result, overnight, an extra 30 million Americans had high blood pressure. And of course, not because their blood pressure had gone up, but because criteria had changed. And it's clear to me that this has happened with autism. And that's clearly a really important driver for understanding the rising numbers of diagnoses we're seeing. I mean, if you just look at the diagnostic criteria over the years, they've been revised. They are broader than they used to be. And there's also empirical evidence that children diagnosed more recently have, on average, lower autism trait scores compared to children diagnosed a decade or two ago, which would fit with that idea as well. So one needs lower levels of biologically determined autistic traits to receive a diagnosis now than you did previously. And now I'd like to think a bit about how we can understand why that has happened. And to set us on this path, let's consider some distinctive features of this lowering of the autism diagnostic threshold. So firstly, unlike the example I gave with blood pressure, it was not planned, it was not transparent, and it was not explicit. It wasn't a sort of centrally sort of affected change. Rather, I think it would that this growth, this broadening of the diagnostic category, has been driven as much by a growth in demand as a growth in supply. And so I mean by that this is, at least in part, a grassroots phenomenon that is significantly driven by demand from parents and from people seeking a diagnosis. It can't just be understood as the vested interests of professionals, for example, seeking to benefit from diagnosing more autism. And on this point, for autism diagnosis at the moment in many countries, demand outstrips supply. So, for example, currently in the UK, there's nearly 250,000 people currently on waiting lists for an NHS autism assessment, frequently waiting over 2 years to be seen. And then another point I want to make when I'm to sort of contextualize this idea I'm putting forward, that the threshold the category has been broadened, is this, that whilst broadening means that autistic people these days are much more likely than previously to have sort of regular cognitive function, to have fluent speech, to be in mainstream education, or as adults to be in employment, we should not make the mistake of seeing these people as largely the worried well. Instead, as a group, they are people who are experiencing high levels of distress, alienation, and disability. We see this across the lifespan. There's an extensive empirical literature attesting to this, to the wide-ranging and significant difficulties experienced. So now I want to share some ideas about what might be driving this demand-driven broadening of the autism category. And I'm going to do that by asking the following question, which is, what do people hope to get from an autism diagnosis in sort of contemporary practice? So there's a fairly extensive literature on this, mostly qualitative research. And broadly, there are two things people talk about wanting from an autism diagnosis. So first, a key benefit that it brings, and which in fact has been shown to be related to changes in well-being, is related to identity and belonging. So you have to think of autism diagnosis not just as a precursor to intervention, but as an intervention itself. It changes people, it changes their relation to themselves and to others. So this is a literature review summarizing literature relevant to this topic, and very common for people to report prior to diagnosis feeling highly alienated, afraid of saying, I felt like I was on the wrong planet. And the diagnosis can sometimes operate as being what's known in the literature, and this is a verbatim quote from an autistic participant, as a not guilty verdict, a re-narrativizing, a restoring of their past struggles and difficulties, so that these are understood not as a personal failing, but instead as the consequence of having an undiagnosed condition. And also, the diagnosis as intervention can bring with it other identity benefits, such as a sense of belonging to an autism community of like-minded people, often online. So that's the first key benefit that people are seeking from an autism diagnosis. And the next one that you find really jumps out in the literature and certainly fits with my clinical experience is, of course, that they want the diagnosis to bring them support, including access to services, and accommodation within their environments, adaptations to the environment, to the expectations placed on them in order to alleviate distress, disability, and alienation. And so if we think about that sort of transactional person environment idea I shared earlier, people are essentially looking to improve their person environment fit, thereby to make their lives better, to be more able to thrive, to have better well-being. And I think it's telling that people are looking for an alleviation from the challenges posed by their environment. And on that basis, to finish, this is the sort of question I want to engage with, the idea I want to explore a little bit, which is that, can we understand the rising prevalence and broader boundaries of autism, at least in part for some people, in relation to the following: that perhaps key characteristics of the environment have changed since the 1990s, when we see this escalation of diagnosis, in ways that are especially challenging for people with neurobiologically grounded high autistic traits, thereby lowering the level of autistic traits that are associated with clinically relevant levels of distress, disability, and alienation. And so I think here, part of the task is to attempt to characterize the nature of any changes that have been happening, especially in certain countries, in the environment since the 90s, that could be relevant to this question. And to do that, one of the things I've done is draw upon a kind of subgenre of the psychology literature that's interested in shifts that intensify in the 1980s and 1990s in the culture, driven by changes to the economic conditions in certain high-income countries. So in this literature, people often use phrases like a move from Fordism to post-Fordism, describing a collection of kind of intensifying challenges, including an intensification of individualism and competition, a growing onus on the population to show flexibility, including in managing job precarity, a growing need to develop highly specialist technical skills, and an ever-growing proportion of the population working in the service sector, where social interaction and the management of other people's feelings is not something you do on your lunch break, it's the main task, it's the job. So, for example, Stephen Butler, the Canadian psychologist, has argued that with this shift to what he often calls advanced capitalism, we see a number of social and psychological characteristics becoming ever more prominent in the population: individualism, status seeking, competition, self-optimization. And as he writes, quoting Han here, the new commandment of the late modern society is the imperative to achieve. And there is empirical evidence that there has been a shift in line with this in the psychology and, if you like, relation to others of young adults. Certainly in the evidence really comes that I'm drawing on from USA, UK, and Canada. So over the last 40 or 50 years, we've seen a rise of things like socially prescribed perfectionism, young people reporting feeling subjected to ever higher expectations from those around them, and the intensification of extrinsic individualistic values, such as the pursuit of fame, money, high status, and the decline of intrinsic, more collectivist values, such as affiliation and community. And so in an increasingly competitive culture, what capacities must be developed and demonstrated? I think Robert Chapman's work here is useful. So Robert Chapman is a philosopher, an autistic person, and a leading thinker, really, in the neurodiversity movement. And he's emphasized the ever-growing sensory and flexibility demands of contemporary economies and environments, as well as the escalation of sociality. And I find here particularly helpful the work of Arlie Hochschild in her book, The Managed Heart, Commercialization of Human Feeling, in which she argues that shifts within the economy, and particularly an ever greater number of people working in what we might call service jobs, that involve emotional labor, transforming experience of their environment and of themselves. So you see here her definition of emotional labor, which requires one to induce or suppress feelings in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces a proper state of mind in others. So we're talking about an ever-increasing onus to be skilled in managing the minds and the feelings of other people, which of course is just the sort of thing that people with high autistic traits tend to find challenging. And we do find in the qualitative literature, looking at the lived experience of autistic people in the last 10 years or so, that the pervasiveness and the difficulty of emotional labor is a continuing theme, and is also reported as engendering a sense of social alienation, distress, and disability. So these are examples from work which mainly applies to adults, but of course, mostly people are diagnosed as autistic in childhood. So children need to be prepared for the world they will enter as adults, and that's one way the demand of the labour market can influence and condition childhood. And I think one phenomenon of relevance here is the rise of social and emotional literacy classes in schools. So this is a body of knowledge and practice in education that arose in the 1990s, initially the USA. And right from the start, it's explicitly identified the need for children to develop their social capacities in order to boost their cognitive development, but also to make them better, more fit, and more prepared for labour market success. And in practice, it involves monitoring and attempting to foster a range of social skills that you can see on this slide here. And it's become, for example, in the UK, an integral part of schooling. So no, I'm not saying that SEL is a overall bad, or that's not what I'm trying to say here. I'm sure it has benefits, but I want to highlight its implications for that proportion of children with autistic traits. It seems to me that the preeminence of SEL in, for example, UK and US education, it both reflects and perpetuates the exacting standards that are placed on the social capacities of school children. And you see how in an environment where the development of a sort of ideal social style is increasingly considered an essential outcome of education, there will be a section of the pupil population, including those with higher autistic traits, who will struggle to meet this demand. So to conclude, what is autism now? I've been very keen to stress throughout this presentation that I am talking about something grounded in a neurodevelopmental reality, if you like. We're talking, it's a dimensional neurodevelopmental difference, strongly influenced by genetic variability. But when we think about the function that diagnosis is performing, I'm not saying for all autistic people actually, but for some, and I think the ones who largely account for the great growth in diagnosis, I think we think this is aimed at mitigating disability, distress, and alienation, increasingly experienced by those with high autistic traits, as they seek to navigate a highly competitive culture that places increasing demands on their social flexibility and sensory capacities. So thank you for listening to my thoughts on this. I will stop sharing now and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Great, thank you, Will. Yes, great. I see we have Lorraine first, and then Lisa.
Thanks so much, Will. That was really fascinating. I have a question about the specificity of autism as a sought for alleviation of the distress that many people feel. It certainly tallies with the increased demand. The question is, there are many diagnoses which might deliver the non-guilty verdict, but no one, for example, seems to be relieved when they get a diagnosis of schizophrenia, for example. So what is there specifically about autism that is at once a relief, but not a stigma?
I think that's a really important point. So there's a couple of thoughts I have on that. I think firstly, my sense, and I'm not at the moment drawing on empirical work, I'm thinking about my clinical experience. Sometimes the diagnosis you get depends on the clinic you go to. And so, you know, especially as things like autism and ADHD are poorly distinguished, they overlap a lot. So I think there is a somewhat haphazard application of these labels. But I think to come to the substance of your point, it's important to recognize that certainly in the UK and the USA, although not actually in all segments of the population in the UK, there has been a huge decrease in the stigma attached to autism. And I think that is part of this story, clearly, that there is a problem that I've outlined. And if you hold certain belief systems about autism not being being a not guilty verdict, then that is one of the sort of solutions you might reach for. Interestingly, one of the core ideas of the neurodiversity movement is that it is unethical to talk about a cure for autism. That would be akin to saying, well, we're going to try and cure this person of being gay. And so I think part of the attraction here for people, part of the sort of how this diagnosis is able to fulfill this function of a not guilty verdict is that it seems to have something baked in about acceptance as opposed to need to change. And it is often used within the neurodiversity paradigm to very much place the understanding of challenges that a person faces externally to the person. So I think that might be a factor in what you're talking about. But again, it's very culturally specific. I believe there is some work done in South Korea, admittedly a while ago, where parents were much keener for their child to be diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder than autism, because they didn't want to have the sort of idea that they had a genetic sort of trait within their family, which is the very, very opposite of what would happen in many Western countries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, next.
Thank you. Thanks, Will. That was great. I was wondering if you're familiar with the work of a sociologist called Nicholas Rose. He wrote a book a long time ago called Governing the Soul, and it's about how psychology participated in shaping modes of subjectivity that were exactly coinciding with what you described, you know, the expectations on the individual, etc., the fact that individuals are made self-responsible for their lives, etc., etc. And listening to you, I was wondering if psychology, or at least quarters of it, were moving towards different directions where perhaps instead of individualizing problems that are actually structural, there is a recognition of the political aspects of why individuals sometimes fail to perform or to coincide with the expectations, the social expectations that are placed on them. But on the and then on the other question of stigma that you were discussing with Lorraine, perhaps there's so it has become less of a stigma, but there is still to what extent it remains a kind of othering, this diagnosis of autism and a difference. So which yeah.
I think, yeah, so the first question, my sense is that it's a bit like so much these days. Psychology is a very broad church, and there are plenty of people working away in one corner on highly sort of medical biological models, hoping to really explain autism via the identification of certain genetic variants, and then the proteins they make and how they shape the brain and so on. And then there are other people right over in the other corner who don't engage with that work at all, and who are much more interested in social context and understanding, and not individualizing people's difficulties. So for example, there are long traditions of community psychology, and sort of critical psychology disciplines that would do that. So in a sense, I think that tendency, and I am aware that Rose has been influential on, for example, texts in the neurodiversity movement, has been there for a while, but there still is a sort of a polarization. In a sense, you have different fields all operating sort of, it gives a false impression that they're all sitting under the same label in a sense, or even sometimes sitting in the same department.
Thank you.
And then the other point about othering, I think that's really interesting, and stigma. There were some really intriguing studies done by a guy called Noah Sasson over in Texas. And they got people to record just little 10-second segments of themselves performing a kind of social task. I think they had to pitch themselves to be on a game show or something like that. Little 10-second segments. Half the people who did it were autistic, half the people who did it weren't. And then Sasson and colleagues showed these segments to a large sample of undergraduates without revealing that this was anything to do with autism, and certainly not revealing that some of the people in the little vignettes were autistic, and asked those students to rate the people in the vignettes, these little slices of social information they got, in terms of things like how much would you like to be friends with them, how much would you like to go on a date. And what was striking, and I think is telling about the challenges that autistic people face, was that the autistic people tended to get lower ratings on those, even though nobody knew they were autistic. And I think there is something about humans and human condition where people are exquisitely sensitive to even very small deviations from kind of social norms, and just need very little information to make these unconscious judgments. So, and then what was interesting was that Sasson and colleagues in a subsequent experiment revealed who was autistic and who wasn't, and it appeared to undermine that effect. It's, so in that population of presumably liberal progressive students, it was an anti-stigma intervention diagnosis. But I don't wish to deny that, of course, it plays out in complex ways with different people. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, and Gert next.
Yeah. Will, thank you for the stimulating talk. I have a remark and a question. The remark is, in my talk, I mentioned that some of the biases are defined against logic, pure logic, and people who use social intelligence, like in framing, are classified as biased. From that, it might well be that autistic people would show less of those kind of biases. And we've talked about that, and there would be a great study. Then I have a question on the stigma that Rainey brought up. It seems that in the last 20 years, it is the age of tech nerds. And all studies and all stories I know about the people hired in Google and otherwise, there are quite a number of people whom we would classify nerds. So a bit socially enabled. And even into the CEOs like Elon Musk, Zuckerberg. They're all probably very far on your normal distribution to the right. So wouldn't that suggest that given the success of the tech nerds, Asperger's and autism would become less a stigma?
Yes, and I think that has happened, in the sense that, in that same way that I think the term is misused often, where people say, "Oh, I was just being really autistic," and people use it to talk about just elements of themselves. And I think in some environments, it is really destigmatized. I I suspect that I'd be really interested to see how those tech firms that surely employ, and retain and really seek to probably compete for large numbers of autistic staff, how they set it up, because my suspicion is, especially as these companies, as you say, are already led by and staffed by people with high autistic traits, whether there are ways of working that actually are providing a decent personal environment fit for those individuals. And certainly there is a sort of growing industry in the UK of people consulting to tech firms, finance, about how to make their companies more autism friendly. I think for some of the reasons that you're talking about, for not just for in the interests of sort of, let's say, doing well by doing good is probably the intention there. I really agree when you were talking about large worlds and small worlds, and biases. There is, as we spoke about earlier, there are some theories of cognitive theories, if you like, of autistic processing that take the view that is characteristic of autism, is sort of approaching things with less bias. And I found myself thinking about the social world versus the mechanistic world when you were talking about some situations where there may well be quite a discrete set of definable outcomes. That ain't the social world, is it? And so that could be very helpful for understanding sometimes that uneven profile that in fact is implicit in your comment about the tech people. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And last question, Aliénor.
Thanks, Will. I really, really liked this presentation. So really, thank you. My question was that I was wondering whether there may be problematic counterpart of the better acceptance of autism precisely in this neoliberal world. Because I was thinking, I mean, the point of being successful and self-optimized is a difficult thing which has been created by the neoliberal and capitalistic system. So now, if we come with this idea that now autism, which is still some kind of stigmatized situation, is the explanation for some people not being able to cope with these new expectations, it may be very convenient for this neoliberal system to say, hey, I agree, it's super difficult, and now there are people who are not able to cope with these standards, but it's okay, you're a bit autistic, that's okay, and you have a diagnosis for your inability to cope with these standards, but maybe the problem is that these standards are not fair, and that instead, I don't say that we should compete between that, but it maybe to be a bit provocative, instead of saying we should accept more people who are unable to cope with these standards, maybe we should lower the standards. And I'm afraid that there might be some easiness for people who are in favor of these new expectations.
Yes, yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting political dilemma that you put forward. So, for example, Mark Chapman, the guy I mentioned earlier, and he describes himself as a neuro-Marxist, and he's gunning for full-out revolution. you know, and a total rejection of the kind of well, the changes that I talked about in my talk. I mean, certainly my work, like, maybe I'm just being too centrist, but I feel like there is things like universal design are helpful compromises, for example. So I think there is a sense in which, you know, and that's partly why I was interested in doing this work. I think there are things that we can learn from the predicament of these people who are being labeled, who are autistic, insights about how changes in the culture are driving us to high levels of mental health problems, stress, and so on, and then apply those insights more widely. So often, for example, just to narrow it down to something practical, if you're working with a kid and you're basically, you know, so often the main thing you're doing is trying to get the school to make adaptations to accommodate the child better. So often those accommodations would actually be useful to almost all of the children in that classroom. And so I'm not, you know, looking for, you know, I think that is the way to take this, but I do take your point about the risk of it almost being a kind of, the diagnosis acting as a release valve of pressure building up. Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Will and everyone. This is all the time we have for this section.